like to welcome everyone to my third connection point, and I'm very excited to have this conversation today, which kicks off our 75th anniversary of AILA. And today our guest is Robert Juceam, and to those of us who know him well, we just call him Bob. Bob, happy to have you with us here today.
Hey, thank you for having me along, and I'm so delighted that you've started this series and help folks who do not know or have not been around AILA long enough to come and meet some of the folks who've helped make it.
And we appreciate everything you've done to make AILA very important. My understanding is that you joined AILA in 1968. Is that correct?
Well, there's some argument over whether it's the last of 67 or January of 68, but it's close enough.
Some of our membership didn't even exist at that time in the world, so it's very exciting. Can you tell us about AILA's grown since that time period, just the different way, the membership numbers, the way we talk to members? Just give us a walkthrough of time, if you don't mind.
Well, I'll tell you, my kids, when I would talk to them, they were born in the 70s. When I talked to them about President Kennedy, I got this blank stare. So I appreciate people being willing to sit through a timeline when things that I speak about are really beyond their own experience. AILA was founded by a group of lawyers in 1946, most of whom had just returned from World War II. They had been promised to be restored to their jobs as NATS examiners for INS. And as typically occurs, over half of them did not get their jobs back. So they basically started solo practices in immigration law and came together to form AILA. And that particular group early on consisted not only of men, but of extraordinary women who were successively in leadership positions from then, 1946 through the 70s. We had no internet. We hardly had workable telephones. The meetings forced people to actually come because that's where all of the hot news of doings in immigration were revealed. The Immigration Service ran on its district offices, and those who practiced in immigration somehow or other 2, 3, 4 times a week showed up there in order to do live interviews. They got to know the staff. They got to see the regulations, which otherwise people didn't really have. They certainly never saw operating instructions. They never got guidance from central office. It was a wholly different context in which we practiced. The preference system also had features in it that made it of a challenge because the beginning of the labor cert process was right in that period. And there was nothing more arbitrary than INS, than the Department of Labor. We had very few lawyers who knew how to litigate or wanted to put their foot in a courthouse. It was strange and foreign to their experience and actually their knowledge. So one of the things we early settled on was we needed in the 70s to figure out how to get a litigation presence. So let me take you from the beginning of 46 to kind of the middle of the 70s. We would have an annual meeting like we used to have until 2 years ago. And we had about 1,000 members total, 1/3 of whom would come to the annual meeting. People used the meeting as a place to stay a day later or stay a day earlier. What was clear was the camaraderie built up between the lawyers at that event. Lifelong friends were made, people exchanged ideas and strategies, reported on differences, just like we do now in the districts. But it was a slower pace. There was not a lot of money around because we tried to keep our dues low. Did you hear that before? People wanted more for the money they paid. Did you hear that before? So the issues that we dealt with were part and parcel of our existing technology, our culture, and our ability to actually mount a case against the government. My sense is that the major change came about in 1980, 81, and 82. In that period, Charles Foster of Texas, a past president, was president, and he wanted to create, as I did, I was president after him, a national office. I wanted us to be in DC. I wanted us to have access promptly to run over to the Hill or to an agency and begin to have policy influence. Now, I should say that in 1978, Jerry Malmuth, a past president from New York, also had something that was new and different for us. He wanted meetings held in the Midwest and on the West Coast. We had chapters there, but they were a minority of our members. And many of them were quite happy to come to Puerto Rico, to Washington, to New York for meetings. But Jerry thought we would be cheating ourselves, not having direct contacts with national people in Midwest and Far West. And his was the first year where we held 2 board meetings in the Midwest. And that condition grew year by year until there was no predisposition to East Coast, West Coast. The arguments were over whether we should be inside or outside the US. And as usual, for a winter event, everybody wanted free sunshine and no rain. And I shared that. I couldn't guarantee it, but I should.
Well, this sounds very interesting to me because it seems like it's always been about community, that it was a bunch of community that started it. It was a community that built it. It was a community that said, we can't just have a DC focus. How do you feel about the community today? Do you feel the same way? Is it the same type of community of builders and caregivers for the organization and each other?
Yeah, I would say in the passage of time, in the growth of membership, in the complexity of what AILA does, there is a remarkable amount of collegial exchange and respect. And maybe being on the board leads some people to think that there are differences. Yes, there are differences. There were differences between people who only did employment-based work and those who did family work. And nobody wanted to do asylum. And nobody wanted to do, I say nobody to emphasize the point, that's not literally true, didn't want to really take on pro bono. The Solos said they do pro bono every day when their clients don't pay them. And by the way, it took me in the ABA a good decade before we eradicated the notion that the lawyer who's stiffed somehow is doing pro bono. But I appreciate it as a single lawyer, you have not only often family or friend commitments and a practice commitment, you need some time for yourself. You burn out if you don't. So the notion of doing pro bono and actually committing substantial time is something hard for people. They are born with the notion that their role as a lawyer is to provide help to those who need it, and particularly those less fortunate who can't afford it. If tomorrow every alien that needed help came to Alan Orr, nobody could get within 3 blocks of your office. That's the ratio of underserved. That's why I supported AILA getting involved with Judge Katzman when he started his catchment study group in 2007. So the timeline we were talking about, I don't want to get ahead.
But I think before we go back to the timeline, I think that it's super interesting that this is the reason why the bar celebrates you so much of your leadership in these spaces. And part of what they've tasked me to do is to actually know a little bit about you. I mean, you always talk about the immigration bar, you always talk about these great things that you've built, and we see them and they're there, they're pillars, and we'll see them for all times. But in this moment today, as we celebrate you, we also want to know a couple of things about you. So I'm going to ask you just a couple of quick questions about you. So
do I have
what's your favorite book?
privacy rights?
Yes, of course, all privacy rights apply. What's your favorite book?
Oh, it's clear to me, the Constitution.
Okay. What's your favorite song?
Bye Bye Baby.
What's the favorite place you visited in the world? Where have you been that everybody should go and see?
There is no one, but the place that I pick is Acapulco, because on an unexpected trip, starting at the airport in departure, I saw a gal. My eyes said, "You love her." And by the time we came back together, I proposed. And so I linked my favorite place to the love of my life.
And her name is?
I'm sorry?
And your wife's name is?
Oh, Eleanor.
Exactly.
Eleanor, Pam, I'm going to give a plug to the women in our group. Eleanor is the president of a group called Veteran Feminists of America. And anybody interested in the second wave of feminism, which is basically the period of Gloria Steinem, Kate Millett, Eleanor was there, and she's been for several years now the president of a group that's aging out, but it's got all kinds of things that would challenge young women in seeing how their message is carried forward. So I'll leave the commercial there. But in AILA, I mean, I was so happy when we created a formal diversity and inclusion program. We had diversity and inclusion from day one in AILA. And just look at the list of presidents online, and you'll see the women almost outnumbered the men in the first 12 years. And that was continued. So I'm sorry we don't have some biographies of the earlier women leadership, but that seems to me a task for those who are interested in developing our history.
What woman president before you stood out? What one woman president earlier on that we don't know about that did something that stood out to you?
I would just start with Lena Olo Ginsburg and the leadership she brought to us, particularly education. Of course, she came from a family of immigration lawyers. Her husband was a president of AILA before her. Jimmy Olo was a president thereafter. They were terrific in their role, and it was not just I'm showing up at meetings and contributing. They were elbow grease folks that actually produced positive, lasting benefits for the people they were working with. And one of the past presidents and leader was Edith Lowenstein, a refugee from Germany who came to the US, learned English, became a lawyer. And Edith was a longtime executive director of Freedom House in New York. She held seminars. She was out in the community. She was producing materials that others could pick up and work with. And she always had an ear for people who called. And it's in part the notion that we have to take care of each other. That's why in our charter from 46, we talk about cultivating the science of jurisprudence. It's a little old fashioned, and those words come off my tongue fairly quickly, but we cared about that. And every time I would go to Washington with Stanley Mailman in the 70s and Bill Taffet, a former immigration judge, and testify, we always ended up before committees where whatever we were trying to convey made very little difference in what came out of their efforts. They were cordial and so on, but Senator Eastland, who headed the Judiciary Committee, interesting fellow. His wife owned acres upon acres of farmland. And if you tried to screw around with what's now H2, baby, you can't get anywhere with Eastland. Subsidies, I mean, so the politics for a long time have affected how Congress reacts and what can get squeezed into a bill. When I first practiced law, that was in '67, we had a category called non-pref. And non-pref was after the first 6 defined preferences. In non-pref was a category that permitted an alien who invested $3,000 or more in a business in the US to get a green card. My clients I did some business in non-pref. My clients could barely afford the 3,000. None of them were captains of industry, but they earned their right to be here. Every year we had a fight over those in Congress who says, you're buying your visa. It's anti-American. So the various phrases, pro and con, any particular part of our bill, always made politics very difficult. And that was true for the 86 Act. I mean, we've always had naysayers. Mm-hmm. And while we're trying to manage policy, and by the way, hats off to our current leadership, their focus on communication with members, being Johnny on the spot to respond to all kinds of inquiries concerning policy and where some senator or congressman is thinking. We didn't have that. You know what we had? We had the one king executive director in our history called Lydon. When we hired Warren Lydon, and that was a suggestion of Charles Foster, I said yes. I said to Warren, you can't come with us unless you go to Washington. And he's a Boston kid. So he said yes. He got an apartment. And at that year, 82, the Rapifax machine, believe it or not, made by Rapifax.
Yeah.
It was almost as tall as you, Alan. And that thing would bang away in his bedroom at night because I was busy during the day. So I would be sending stuff 3 or 4 times a week at that hour. And he's never complained, but I know it was not the best. But Warren went to Washington, is the way I put it. And he opened a new vista for us of the importance of having a place by the seat of government.
Well, we'll probably capture that as well within the 75th anniversary. And as we sort of bring it to a close, why don't you tell us, how would you like to be remembered in AILA? What would you like AILA members at? You've had such a great influence on my career. Many people who sit on the BOG and many people who know you from the ABA. You're a standout lawyer. You're a standout person. You're there for all types of rights, all human rights, all the time. Sort of tell us, what would you like for us to remember about you and AILA? What would you pick?
I had a pretty clear idea of what I wanted, but I was not an immigration lawyer because by 70, I was doing takeovers and insurance defense and trademark cases. I wasn't really, so I didn't have any historical or experiential knowledge. It was with a group of people who had been close-knit, and it never occurred to me that I didn't belong. They never said I didn't belong. But in my own head, I wanted to figure out what I should be accomplishing while I'm in that post and what I can overshoot so that what I don't accomplish, the next person would find interesting enough to pick up. So it's always about legacy. But I'd like to know from you, with 1 year, what do you insist happen? What do you want to happen? And what do you want to leave for the next person with some realistic expectation that they'll care about it?
Yeah. So that's an easy one for me to answer, and it's sort of based on your life and also on Dale Schwartz. My year as president is dedicated to showing members, exposing members, letting members be seen who otherwise would not have been seen before, sort of expanding the bar and the table in the practice area, in the diversity area, and also in the geographic area. One of the things that I've sort of found in AILA is that in the time that it started sort of spreading out and reaching across the country in your world, in my time, it's sort of come back to the East Coast and been very East Coast focused and sort of leaving groups outside of that center blob of what's happening. And so I wanted to make sure that we sort of expand and say, AILA is not a building, AILA is an organization, and everybody's included and everybody's seen. So that's really been my focus. And I think, people like you, people like Dale, who have constantly walked up to be it women, be it minority groups and said, come in the room, let's have a conversation. I mean, part of the history of AILA in the early days was sort of fighting the cases for individuals that didn't look like you, didn't believe the same things that you believe, but just wanted to be here because of the Constitution. And those things are super important to me. So in this short time that I have and half the hall is over, I just want to continue in what you've started, which is making sure that people are good lawyers and that people are doing good things for the membership.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. I hope that your aim gets accomplished.
Thank you so much for your time today, Mr. Juceam. You're kicked off the anniversary. We hope to see you there. Of course, we'll spotlight you and hear more of your wonderful stories. I appreciate your time and your leadership that you've given to the organization. And for me personally, being the first African-American president, it wouldn't have happened without you because you opened many doors for me across the way. So I really appreciate it. Thank you for being with us today.